Who would have thought Wednesday would have started with a reason to talk about Taylor Lautner and Ryan Reynolds in the same video? Definitely not me, but let's get into it. I have to start out by saying that this is one of those topics that you see a news alert come out and you're like, it's just for me. It's just for me. As a very specific part of the Twilight generation, as well as someone who went to school for screenwriting, this Variety headline of Taylor Lautner's new TV show being announced, it's one of those things that just feels like a gift from above. Variety announced today that there is a new TV show in development called Taylor Lautner Werewolf Hunter. The TV show is being developed by Amazon MGM Studios, which means that if it goes forward, it would most likely be on Amazon Prime. And here's the absolutely impeccable logline for this project. After wrapping the final Twilight film, Taylor Lautner vanished from the spotlight. Fans speculated, tabloids theorized, but the truth is wilder than fiction. Taylor wasn't just taking a mental health break. He was preparing for his real calling, Taylor Lautner Werewolf Hunter. Playing himself, Taylor is drawn into a secret society of werewolf trackers who need his unique expertise. As he navigates his double life, Hollywood actor by day, supernatural warrior by night, Taylor must wrestle with the ultimate irony, fighting the very creatures that made him famous. Between saving the world, reviving his career, and falling in love, he faces the ultimate question: what happens when your biggest role becomes your greatest enemy? Now, the thing about this show concept is that it's actively brilliant. I think a lot of people are going to feel a certain type of way about it, but I think Taylor Lautner is sort of this semi-enigma that happened after the Twilight saga. As we know, the Twilight saga was one of the most popular film franchises from 2008 all the way through 2012 when Breaking Dawn Part 2 came out. And I think a lot of people forget that the first Twilight film was actually a box office shocker. The movie, when it was in production, was very much treated like an indie film, and their budget was actually slashed right before they started filming itself. The film shocked everyone because in a stacked year, the first Twilight film was actually the 8th highest film in the box office that year, and it actually beat the James Bond film that came out that year, Quantum of Solace. There are so many things that we could say about why this film overperformed, but largely it was an underestimation of how much women would turn out to go to the box office. Those films continued to be large commercial successes, and the budget continued to increase as we went through them. And not only that, but there's been an entire economy built just on Twilight tourism alone. You can stay in Bella Swan's house as an Airbnb. There are entire film tours that happen in Oregon where they shot the films, and there is a Twilight festival every year in Forks, Washington. On top of that, not only was Twilight itself successful, but we also saw one of the first major successes of fan fiction going through this process that we call filing off the serial numbers. 50 Shades of Grey was a massive commercial success that started as Twilight fan fiction, and not only were the books highly successful, they also had their own film franchise that came out of them. There is pretty much no denying that Twilight has been a cultural milestone, and we're starting to see a resurgence of it in film itself. There's an animated Midnight Sun series in development. We also, of course, saw Midnight Sun itself released as a book in 2020, and generally speaking, the Twilight excitement has not died down. And so if we come back to Taylor Lautner, one of the things that's actually quite brilliant about this series is that there is sort of this question about him not being as successful as other people in the film franchise. Kristen Stewart and Robert Pattinson 100% went on to be movie stars. Prior to the Twilight franchise, Robert Pattinson had already been in Harry Potter, but his career actively took off with the Twilight franchise itself. Kristen Stewart was also a child actress before and had plenty of credits underneath her belt before Twilight, but again, Twilight becoming this huge success that nobody really expected it to be skyrocketed her to a different type of fame. Both Kristen Stewart and Robert Pattinson found this balance of being sort of critical darlings and indie heroes, as well as taking a couple blockbuster films. And for both of them, their names are still hugely expected to be box office draws. So much so that neither of them are really present on social media, and they're able to kind of maintain a private life when it comes to their romance. And then on the flip side, we have Taylor Lautner, where his co-stars had major moves lined up for directly after the Twilight films were over. Taylor sort of struggled to find his place. We saw him try to kind of be an action hero, but Tracers, his next big film, didn't come out until 3 years after the Twilight saga ended. In fact, post-Twilight, he only has 7 credits, 8 if you include an uncredited role in Grown Ups 2. And one of those 7 credits is actually a music video for Taylor Swift. And so there's something kind of brilliant in taking this 3-year resume gap and saying, what if he was hunting werewolves? There were so many different ways they could have gone about this. There could have been vampires involved, but there's something very, very fun in doing it this way. I think there's also kind of a fun twist here, right? Because we saw him push for kind of action roles, and those roles did not really succeed. We actually saw something very similar with Dylan O'Brien post Teen Wolf, where he pushed into kind of these action hero roles, which didn't end up bringing over the audience he had already amassed on Teen Wolf, and then took a small gap and found a little bit more success in sort of romantic leads and sort of indie darling weird movies. And I think we're kind of going to see that shift with Taylor Lautner here, because one of the things that I think Taylor Lautner is actually quite good at is comedy. Roles that kind of worked for him included the Valentine's Day movie that he was in with Taylor Swift, where he sort of plays like a silly jock. I thought he was quite fun in Scream Queens, which again was comedic, and objectively his SNL appearance while he was still a part of the Twilight saga was honestly very, very fun and really, really good comedic timing, especially for a host. Toronto is the studio behind Taylor Lautner Werewolf Hunter. I really love the title. Every time I say it, I'm gonna laugh. And they're also responsible for the TV show BoJack Horseman. So they're not unfamiliar with shows that have a great comedic element and also that play along with the idea of show business. I think from this team, you're gonna see some really good meta commentary about the business itself, what it means to be a teen hero and not necessarily find your next steps afterwards, and probably a little bit about shape-shifting to make yourself fit into the industry itself. There's also a little hint at the fact that he will fall in love, and so I do wonder how much of his actual real life will be flipped into this versus sort of a fictional love. But again, I think there's something interesting about the fact that Taylor Lautner is returning to the spotlight in a way that is very personal and open about his own self. This is obviously a fictionalized version of it, but one of the reasons why you're starting to see Taylor Lautner on your feed again is because he hosts a podcast with his wife, who's also named Taylor. And we've seen the two of them kind of share a little bit more about their relationship, interview famous people, and give their own commentary on pop culture events. Most recently, I actually remember seeing Taylor Lautner's wife, Taylor Lautner, on my feed because she was actually asking ColourPop to send her the New Moon collaboration that they did. And there's this weird kind of blend of personal life from like a massive celebrity from the 2000s. There is that interesting split that he has from his co-stars that he's being compared to. Kristen Stewart and Robert Pattinson actively seem to avoid social media and sharing their own personal lives. I think the most that we've seen from Robert Pattinson about his personal life recently was when Suki Waterhouse actually called him for a prank. He was on the phone and she tells him that Love is Blind wants them to be the hosts for the new show, and you kind of hear him laugh and realize that it's a prank. I think that's kind of the most personal we've seen anything about him other than a few comments about his child. And I think if he had wanted to hide the fact that he had had a kid, they would have found a way to do it. Robert Pattinson himself has made a lot of commentary on fame and how it doesn't necessarily suit him. There was a GQ piece that he did where it talked about sort of like the mania that comes from going outside when you're that famous. And Kristen Stewart, on the flip side, really just doesn't talk about her personal life at all, which a lot of people may say is probably the healthiest way to deal with celebrity, to sort of be able to do your work, go home, and ignore the idea of anybody saying anything to you. And I think it also allows them to have this sort of interesting mystique. One of my favorite things Robert Pattinson ever did was the GQ profile that he did during lockdown, where he's being interviewed over FaceTime at one point, and he starts to pitch his idea for drive-through pasta companies. The interview was conducted entirely over FaceTime in isolation before Tenet was supposed to come out, and there's this one chunk of it that I am going to read to you because I think it kind of encompasses the way that Robert Pattinson has been able to create this persona for himself. Basically, in this chunk of the interview, he's telling the interviewer about this business idea that he's had. He basically builds this idea on what if pasta really had the same kind of fast food credentials as burgers and pizzas. I was trying to figure out how to capitalize in this area of the market, and I was trying to think, how do you make a pasta which you can hold in your hand? He says he went so far as to design a prototype that involved the use of a panini press. The interviewer goes on to explain that Robert Pattinson actually contacted restaurateurs, and that interviewer contacted the same people to make sure that this was true, and they said yes. And then on FaceTime, he starts to actually demonstrate and cook this sort of prototype that he's come up with. He puts on latex gloves, he pulls out some sugar and some aluminum foil and makes a bed, a kind of hollowed out sphere with the foil. He holds up a box of penne pasta that he had in the house. All right, Pattinson says, so obviously, first things first, you gotta microwave the pasta. I watch as he pours dry penne into a cereal bowl, covers it with water, and places it in the microwave for 8 minutes. He says using penne is already a new territory for him. Usually he uses, well, do you know the pasta that's like it's a little blob, a sort of squiggly little blob? Gnocchi? No, it looks like, what would you even call it? It looks like a sort of messy, like the hair bun on a girl. I literally have no idea what you're talking about, I say. And the situation kind of spirals out of control from there. At one point, Robert Pattinson actually burns himself cooking this pasta. And the reason that I bring this up is that both Robert Pattinson and Kristen Stewart have found a way to create a persona for themselves that steps outside of their own personalities. Versus Taylor Lautner has gone the opposite direction. He started finding ways to share more of his personal life with you and to use that to create the connection with his audience. This TV show concept will absolutely capitalize on that, while also capitalizing on the nostalgia of the greatest concept that he's ever been a part of. Yes, the Twilight Saga films are the greatest concept that Taylor Lautner has ever been a part of. And there's something quite fun about that. And honestly, I think this may be one of those situations where if the TV show actually goes forward, it will be something that at least does very well for one season. One of the best comparisons that I can make that actually did go into production was Bo Burnham's show Zach Stone is Going to Be Famous. That show only got one season on MTV, but it played on this sort of meta idea of what we knew of Bo Burnham at the time. Bo had become incredibly famous for making YouTube comedic videos in his bedroom. He then became became, at the time, one of the youngest comedians to have an HBO special. He also had a Comedy Central special, and he had this sort of role in changing what a comedian could be. Zach Stone Is Gonna Be Famous followed a 17-year-old who spent all of his college money in hiring a documentary crew to follow him around, playing on this idea of the sort of ego that it takes to start making YouTube videos, to believe that you could be a famous person at 17 years old, and to risk your entire future on doing just that. I thought the TV show honestly was one of the best things that MTV had made, and I kind of feel like I should put in a disclaimer that I did intern for MTV, but it was after Zach Stone Is Gonna Be Famous was already off the air, so I did not work on that show. But it worked really well because it played on sort of our meta expectations of that character. That actor, character, and network combined really made you go, oh, this works, this scratches a sort of itch for me. And this Taylor Lautner Werewolf Hunter situation kind of has the ability to do the same. And then another completely separate but like kind of throwback reference was Michael Jordan in Space Jam. Space Jam also played with one really big real life moment that was in the culture at the time. And that was the fact that Michael Jordan had retired from basketball and was playing baseball and not necessarily doing the best at it. Space Jam picks up with him playing baseball and then being sucked through the hole in a golf course into Looney Tune land, where the only way he can save the Looney Tunes is through the power of basketball. And of course, at the end of the movie, what does he do? He returns to the Chicago Bulls. That movie came out when that actual thing happening was a big cultural moment, and it played on the expectation that sports fans already had, and sort of this global icon had as well. So the concept has already been proven that it could work, and it could work on a pretty grand scale, especially because both of those examples didn't have the same level of social media aspects that we have now. Taylor Lautner has a podcast with his wife. He has social media, and so does his wife, and they both actively make references to his career as a werewolf, and there is this sort of expectation of where have you been all this time? So that's all the reasons why I think this will work for Taylor Lautner, and I think it'll be really fun for fans, right? But at the beginning of this video, I promised to connect it to Ryan Reynolds. And to do that, we have to go back to one of my favorite scripts that came out in 2014. If you're not familiar with the world of kind of screenwriting and some of the things that happened in it, there is a list called the Blacklist that comes out every year. This list of scripts is run by Franklin Leonard, and basically every year they ask film executives what was the best script that you read that you didn't get to make. All of the scripts on this list are unproduced, and at the end of the year, the list becomes public and people are able to kind of request the scripts from that list if they potentially have an interest in making those films. We've seen a lot of actual successes come off of the Blacklist. Movies like Argo, American Hustle, Juno, The King's Speech, Hell or High Water, Nebraska, tons of movies that you have seen in theaters actually got their start from being on the Blacklist. But there are also a lot of movies that are on the Blacklist that don't actually get made. And in 2014, one of those films was called Am Ryan Reynolds. That screenplay was written by a writer named Billy Golston. And on the 2014 Blacklist, it made it on because 9 different executives voted for it. This script has maybe one of the most insane concepts that I had read at the time, essentially mostly because Ryan Reynolds was not involved in the production of this script at all, at least not to my knowledge, especially because the film never came out. The official logline was an inside look at the marriage, career, and mental state of 2010's sexiest man alive. Now that logline gives you a little bit about this film, right? But not everything that you need to know. In this film, Ryan Reynolds would have starred as himself, but the driving action of this movie was Ryan Reynolds finding out that a plastic surgeon in Los Angeles was giving people his face. I wish there was a better way to deliver that without laughing, but the script itself honestly is so good. But in 2014, the perception of Ryan Reynolds was completely different than it is right now. There were also, at the time, comedic moments that depicted his wife, Blake Lively, and their relationship not necessarily being what it seemed, as well as Ryan Reynolds not necessarily being the nicest guy around. He has to decide what he's going to do about all of these people running around with his face. And in the script, he finds out that this plastic surgeon actually owns the rights to his likeness, and there's no like legal repercussions that he can go after. I'm not going to go through the script line by line since it never was produced, but the concept of this film was really Ryan Reynolds coming to terms with his own personality and his inner demons, and doing that by realizing that everybody around the world can have his face. And so if he doesn't have his sexiest man alive looks, what does he really have? Who is he really inside? When I read that script in 2014, I realized it's the type of script that kind of can get you noticed but won't necessarily get made, because it would have required Ryan Reynolds, Blake Lively, and I think Emma Watson is actually in the script as well, to agree to play themselves in this sort of fictionalized, highly ridiculous version of themselves. Again, I didn't come up with this concept. The movie was never made. It was a screenplay that was kind of passed around and was very popular, but for obvious reasons struggled to get into production. The point being, at the time, I think it actually would have been a really fun thing that Ryan Reynolds could have done. I'm sure it came across his desk at some point and obviously was passed on, but seeing Taylor Lautner announce this decision really made me think back on the script and made me think back on some of the ways that it has been successful for other stars to do this. Taylor Lautner will kind of follow in those steps of Bo Burnham and Michael Jordan Jordan doing something that plays at his actual life and fictionalizes it to a comedic extent that allows the audience to laugh along with him and not really like remember why they didn't want him to be a big star before. I think with Michael Jordan, for example, it really endeared him to a next generation of people. I personally wasn't old enough to like be a Michael Jordan fan because of the Chicago Bulls, but I am exactly the right age to have had a Space Jam couch and to be heavily obsessed with that film. Michael Jordan and the Looney Tunes doing Space Jam endeared him to an entirely new generation of people that maybe never would have seen him play basketball and extended his longevity as like a pop culture icon. Taylor Lautner is in an interestingly similar place, where he has this legendary set of films that he did from 2008 to 2012, and now an entire new generation has been born and is discovering these films, but they're discovering them in a sort of archival version of those movies. This TV show allows him to sort of reintroduce himself, say, I am hilarious, I'm a heartthrob, and if you liked those Twilight movies, you'll definitely like me now. I'm excited for this, but we should also remember that being in development doesn't mean that you will go to actual production. But I am rooting for Taylor Lautner Werewolf Hunter. But I'm curious what you guys think. Do you think this helps him revive his career? Do you think he becomes a new Gen Z heartthrob that he wasn't expecting to be? Or do you think it kind of dies in development and it's too ridiculous of a concept? Let me know in the comments and I will see you soon.